I often find myself thinking about dead tissue. No, I'm not crazy, and it's not some strange fetish. One would argue that it is a matter of utmost necessity, but we'll get to that in a moment. I have discovered a lot about dead flesh in a very short period of time. I was compelled by these conclusions to reject the fictional representations of dead flesh and accept the reality. These are them. First and foremost, dead flesh is nothing more than meat that has lost all of its living components. Blood stops flowing when there is no heartbeat. It gradually causes the skin to turn reddish purple as it stills, cools, and settles in the extremity. The process of liquefaction, which turns your insides into nasty gas and causes extreme bloating, is one of the first indicators of degeneration, even though it takes a body a few years to totally degrade. The skin will also blister and slip. We all know that gas must escape from dead flesh, and once that occurs, the foul internal fluids also escape and are allowed to run and collect wherever they like. Millions of maggots have already feasted on the flesh before it ever reaches that stage. I could go on, but I won't. These are but a few of the technical specifics. The fact remains, however, that the idea of eating dead flesh is abhorrent. It has a brown area that, when pressed with your finger, splits open to disclose mush. It is grossly mushy, spongy, and rotten like an apple. It smells like recently discovered tombs and is disgustingly slimy and damp. All of this is actual knowledge I have. I've already said that I'm neither a fetishist nor insane, but right now I'm confined in my boarded-up house with an impossible-sized zombie horde all around me. I was unaware of current affairs, so I was unprepared and caught off guard. Two managed to get in via my unlocked back door, but I was able to get rid of them rather quickly. However, without any defenses, my residence was exposed and unlikely to be able to keep out the horde of dead pressing on every door and window from eventually getting inside. With my 9mm in hand and what's left of my rounds on the floor next to me, I'm seated in a corner of my living room. I killed 2 zombies, and their remains are just 3 feet away. Their necrotic and bruised skin is visible, as well as the damp spots on their garments where bodily fluids have leaked through. The bullet holes in their heads and the decomposing slime that was once their brains were visible to me. One of them had his lips open in a grimace, showing his shattered and bleeding teeth, and was directly facing me. He appeared to be reaching for me as his arm was extended. Rotting tissue slipped away to show skeletal bone. I looked down and noticed thick, fingerprint-like slime where I had been earlier grabbed. As they entered, I could still hear their moans of hunger, or perhaps even rage at being dead. Their foul smell hangs in the air and is so strong that I can taste it. My gut clenches as I resist the acid that burns its way down my throat as it invades my nose and coated my tongue. The front door crashes open as the dead surge in as a result of the horde's overwhelming weight. From the recently deceased to those who had died weeks earlier, the levels of decay varied. Some people walked while others hobbled along with twisted and, occasionally, broken limbs. They left foul pools of brown muck on my white tile floor behind them in the form of tattered flesh and rotting sludge. I observed them come closer. Although they were no longer alive, whatever motivated them was still visible through the zombie flesh veil. It was like to a battery with a sinister charge, unleashing a horde of nasty, malformed creatures whose only concern was to consume the flesh of anyone they came across. If I let it, that would be me. But that was not the original plan. I didn't have enough shots to stop the oncoming crowd, but I only needed one to make sure I wouldn't become one of them. Although I couldn't be certain it would work, I raised the gun and held it up to my eye socket. I had once heard that this was a better spot to fire a killing shot than under the chin. I fired the gun as the first zombie reached out and lightly touched my cheek. I don't need to think about dead flesh anymore because I now understand it much better than I ever did. About 2 weeks have passed since the gun accidentally discharged, turning my living flesh into delectable fare for the swarm in my living room. They didn't consume me completely, which, in my opinion, would have been preferable, but they left behind enough of me so that I could be transformed into one of them. I was once meat, and now I travel among the dead looking for meat. I have trouble controlling my legs, so I walk with an unnatural, stumbling gait. The unpleasant bloating has made my eyes bulge out of their sockets, and I stink to high heaven. What's left of my skin is already starting to blister and comes off whenever I touch something. It is not at all a comfortable life. I've come to understand that the terrible groaning and moaning that results from damaged vocal cords has nothing to do with the incapacity to speak, and everything to do with the excruciating agony that is caused by the decomposition process. The agony of feeling each organ and cell disintegrate into a foul soup that sloshes inside your slowly extending skin is indescribable to anyone still alive. They were also unable to comprehend the agonizing suffering brought on by the same fluids seeping through growing skin tears. If you can, try to picture the agonizing sensation of rotting ligaments and tendons that enlarge until they ultimately give way, causing the bodily part they formerly stabilized to either dangle by a sinew or simply fall off. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the genuine disposition of dead flesh. For a zombie, life is nothing but searing anguish that can only be momentarily numbed by eating live flesh. When we discovered it, we were just some clueless seniors in high school, a boisterous group that spent the majority of the time drinking and paying little attention in class. Jonathan, Mason, and Enzo, the so-called hick kids, were the only three of us there. We used to go camping in the mountains on the weekends and drink until the sun came up. We didn't have to look for a new campsite until our usual one had been taken. We continued on through the mountains till we came across a location adjacent to a field. There wasn't much of the location left, and it was close to an abandoned farm. The location was rather subpar, and there was a ton of garbage left behind from the previous campers. Even so, the field's enormous amount of area for running made it worthwhile. We tried playing football on the field before it got dark. As Mason almost fractured his foot when he fell into a soft patch, it became out that the field was essentially a death trap. He almost went under all the way, leaving a pretty significant bruising on his calf. When we initially discovered it at night, we tried to play another game by running back into the fields but were repelled by an unseen power. We tried again as we sprinted towards the center of the field, dumbfounded by what we discovered, only to have Enzo get thrown back by the force. The force was stronger the closer you were to the center. No matter where you tried from, the game circled the field in all directions without ever getting simpler. Similar to how magnets repel each other when you bring their opposite ends close together. Without a doubt, that was the best night we had ever spent competing with one another to see how far we could go. We would run at peak speed when intoxicated only to be thrown back. Watching your inebriated friend's body fly through the air never got old. The field appeared to return to normal in the morning. We went back to the field to see if anything had changed, but nothing was there. Every time we went camping after that, we made a point of stopping there to see how far we could go from the storm's eye. We soon began to think outside the box by bringing weights and ice axes. Jonathan once attempted to drive a four-wheeler into a force. It goes without saying that he spent the evening at the emergency department. We were all aware, in some little way, that we were playing around with fate and a phenomenon we didn't really comprehend. However, our curiosity ultimately won out, and the mere prospect of entering the storm's eye was enough to motivate us to work even harder. No matter how hard we tried, none of us were able to reach the center in the end. Everything didn't alter until our final camping trip before graduation. It felt different then. We barely managed to earn a C on every test, since we were worn out after finals. It was a calmer night than the others. We were all reluctant to oppose the force. Most of the time, we simply sat and chatted while drinking beers about the previous several years. We most likely wouldn't see each other again after that night. I didn't want us to spend our final minutes together moping around in our sadness. That evening, I had a strong urge to try entering the circle one more time. I moved in the direction of the field with a spurt of liquid bravery. I sensed that everyone was looking at me. They were speaking in low whispers, and I could hear them doubting that I would survive. I had always been the least capable of the group, barely managing to reach the center. Although I intended to test God's destinies this time, I also wanted to go above and beyond. I entered the field slowly, the power quickly taking over as I stumbled back and nearly fell to the ground. Still, as I limped ahead, I kept pushing directly. Soon after, I began to crawl, grabbing onto the long grass in front of me to prevent my skin from being cut. My hands began to bleed, but the pain only increased my desire for the reward. My chest could feel the pressure, but that only made me want to keep moving forward. I closed my eyes and concentrated only on going further than ever. My body was propelled into the air, and my hold on the ground was the only thing holding me from taking off. My chest started to feel increasingly squeezed, as if I were being pushed away by God herself. I reached forward with everything I had left till the pressure finally let up. Then there was silence, and the world briefly came to a standstill. Despite being worn out, I was ecstatic to have reached the center, something not even a four-wheeler could have accomplished. I could hear my pals cheering as they ran in my direction, breaking the silence. Jonathan screamed with excitement when he picked me up, his face joyful. They both picked me up and whirled me around while chanting "underdog" as Mason passed by. Enzo simply sat there disappointed that I had destroyed the fun, more so than anything else. That was the day I felt the most accomplished. It was like I had scored the winning touchdown in the Super Bowl. I still keep that recollection in mind during difficult times. If only I knew that my bravery would lead to our destruction. The call came 2 days later. At the home of his girlfriend, Mason was discovered dead. I had never experienced true terror until I saw my friend's dismembered corpse. His chest was split apart as the chest was pulled apart. Pieces of bone and flesh from his broken ribs were all over the place. The walls were literally covered in blood. As it dangled beneath the couch, his neck was virtually severed from his skull. His empty, gray eyes appeared to have a filter covering them. He appeared to have witnessed his own demise because of the scared expression that was frozen on his face. According to the autopsy, the lungs were absent and had been completely destroyed. It was as though the lungs had never existed. Mason's girlfriend, Anna, said he was coming to stay the night because her parents were out on business the night before he died. However, when he arrived, he was grasping his chest and clearly in pain, thinking that whatever he had consumed must have caused it. He was trying to be quiet so as not to wake the neighbors as it went on all night, and he was sweating buckets. After trying everything to get Mason to visit the hospital, Anna finally gave up and went to bed. She woke up from her slumber to a loud popping sound. That's how she discovered him when she went to see how he was doing. Despite the lack of any proof of a break-in, it was classified as a homicide, and Anna was the main suspect. If not for the second event, she most likely would have been found guilty. Enzo came next. When he was purchasing narcotics from his plug, it happened. Enzo reportedly arrived late and entered clutching his chest, according to dealer Jack. He was as ghostly white as his carpet, which was covered in sweat. He occasionally would stumble, almost tumbling backwards as though being pushed. In the end, Jack handed him a blunt, thinking it would make him feel better. Jack observed the smoke entering but not exiting as he inhaled. Enzo abruptly came to a stop, his eyes clouded as he lay still on the couch. He spoke in a low voice to himself. Jack drew near but could only make out a few phrases. Cold hands are present. His chest then burst open like a bomb, splashing Jack in blood as blood, guts, and bone rocketed across the space. Jonathan and I realized we would be the next victims if we did nothing after Enzo's second death. We returned to the location in the field by car. Since I hadn't seen it since that evening, there had to be something we missed. When we got there, I went back and retraced my steps, remembering how and where I had found the center. Nothing, absolutely nothing, revealed why this was happening. Then it dawned on me that nothing remained from that evening. That evening, when I sought the center, I bled. Days have passed with no rain. There ought to have been dried blood in that scenario. To the best of my ability, I located the area where I had bled, and I began to delve further. Jonathan came over, and we both started digging madly until our hands became numb. Below, the dirt began to saturate and thicken. We soon realized we were moving blood as our hands swiftly turned from brown to red. Soon, blood predominated over dirt. I pushed the bloody, soaked ground with my hand till I could feel it. I could detect a faint breathing from a solid, slippery slab of flesh under the ground. It required deep, ragged breaths, and I could feel the blood in and out of my arm. We had irritated God by discovering her. The force always came from below. It never came from above. It was its air, which I had taken in my determination to confront her. She is currently taking ours and punishing us one by one. Before I could say anything, I turned to face Jonathan again and noticed that he was gripping his chest out of terror. Before rushing to the car, we rubbed our hands in the grass in an effort to remove the blood. He told me it seemed like a strong hand was digging into him as we were driving. As things worsened, I could tell he was in excruciating pain despite his best efforts to hide it. We eventually made it to the closest emergency room, where I begged the receptionist to call a doctor for Jonathan. He started becoming white as soon as we were placed in a room, and his eyes began to water. He entered a state that resembled a trance and stopped listening to whatever I said. Then he lost it and yelled at me that I was to blame for this and that I had to test God by damning us all. As he grabbed me and dug his nails into my chest, he leaped out of bed. He had to be restrained and fastened to the bed by staff. The doctor could only scan his chest after that. I was simultaneously astounded and horrified by what I witnessed. Two hands' silhouettes could be seen in the image, gently advancing toward the lungs. They were merely pushing the other organs out of the way, literally rearranging Jonathan's internal organs. With each push, Jonathan replied with a pained groan as the hands inched closer to the middle of his lungs. After a few minutes, they succeeded in getting to the storm's eye that was grabbing his lungs. Then, all of a sudden, Jonathan's hair became gray, and so did his eyes. He gave me an angry, defeated look as he turned to face me. "It's so cold," was all he murmured. I did not observe him. I was unable to complete it. As soon as I heard the doctor screaming and the sound of skin and bone tearing, I exited the room. As I made my way home, Jonathan's crushing noise kept playing in my thoughts. Before returning to the field, I gathered a shovel, a light, and my father's old, worn-out shotgun that he kept in the shed. When I arrived, it was very dark, and I could hardly make out the location. I fell into the fields after sensing the familiar, dated force. I pushed and carried out the identical motions I had the previous evening. But despite the additional weight, I was unable to reach the center. I was able to get farther away with each effort. No matter what I did, I was putting a lot of effort into trying to get back. My darkest fear then surfaced as I felt the cool touch on my chest. There wasn't much time left for me. When that time came, I simply had the shotgun strapped on my back and left the lamp and shovel behind. As I proceeded, I closed my eyes to block out any thoughts of fear or loss, and concentrated solely on the storm's eye. I pushed forward with everything I had left until I was on all fours, until my hands were bleeding, until I was grasping the ground, up until the force eventually stopped with one last thrust. I collapsed on the ground, still determined but worn out. Advertisements had drilled into the ground using the little I had left. I could feel the hands trying to rip into my flesh as the pressure on my chest increased. I eventually reached the bottom again after getting progressively bloodier the deeper I went. I dipped my hand into the blood to look for any signs of flesh. I encountered a huge meaty tube instead. I ripped the tube upward with both hands right after the blood. I held it in my hands and watched it rise and fall as air rushed through it more quickly. The hub of the lungs, the trachea, was the culprit. I grasped at my chest and dropped the object just as I was about to rip it apart. My lungs could feel it squeezing them. My body grew chilled, and my vision started to become foggy. I unloaded my shotgun into the hole below as I swung it into my hands. As blood splashed back onto my face, the ground trembled. I could feel the screaming coming from below with each shot. I didn't stop until my vision began to clear up and the tightness in my chest subsided. I finally passed out on the cool grass after collapsing fatigued and closing my eyes. The warmth of the dawning sun roused me up. I dipped my fingers into the ground one final time to look for any signs of life. God had expired. As time passed, the field gradually withered and died in a matter of days. The forest followed suit. For miles, there was no sign of life. As for me, I moved on with life and eventually discovered how to let the past go. I was content for a very long time and never worried about God returning. I didn't feel the cool touch of God again on my chest until late yesterday night. In the end, she prevailed because I was too far away from the fields to stop her. She has been anticipating this chance to exact justice for a very long time. She's making me wait even though I can already feel the icy hand of death grabbing hold of my lungs and preparing to pull at any second. Whether she is savoring every second of this moment before it passes me by, or if she's waiting for me to finish, she'll warn everyone not to make the same error I did. It has the power to end my life, but I won't let fear have its way with me. I'll approach her with all of the strength I still possess from that evening, from the memory of my friends lifting me in joy.